Hello, and welcome to the last episode of Virtual Tours. My name is Matthew, and this week you join me in the heart of southern Burgundy, in the region's wine capital, Beaune. As it's the last episode, I have a bumper edition lined up for you in two parts. This first part focuses on the history of Beaune itself, while in part two, we take a closer look at the wine that makes this part of Burgundy, the Côte d'Or, so special. Beaune is surrounded by some of the world's most famous wine villages, including Nuit Saint-Georges, Pommard and Meursault, and some of the facilities and cellars located in the town itself have been here since Roman times. With such a rich historical and architectural heritage, Beaune is often considered as being the capital of Burgundy wines. Other than being known for its prestigious Pinot Noirs, which are some of the most sought-after wines in the world, the town is known for its glorious medieval heritage, especially that of the charitable hospice, the Hôtel-Dieu de Beaune. When the Romans invaded Gaul in 52 BC, they immediately started work on the nearby city of Bude, which was built to serve as the capital of the region to control the local Gallic tribes. The Roman elite planted many vines in the surrounding area during the next 2 centuries, and gradually these new crops modelled the landscape. The Burgundy wine region was promised a great future and flourished during the second half of the 1st century. Having been settled since prehistoric times, Beaune's name is derived from a Latinized Gallic word, Elena, which was the name of the spring around which the settlement was established by its original inhabitants, the Celts. The town, however, prospered under the region's new Roman rulers and found wealth as a centre for both livestock and viticulture. During the 3rd and 4th centuries, Beaune was fortified and protected against invasions of the Germanic Visigoth and Ostrogoth tribes, and was later the seat of the Count under the Frankish king Charlemagne, all the while enjoying the fortunes gathered from the rich vineyards which surrounded the town. In the early 13th century, a charter devised under the Duke of Burgundy, Otto III, gave the inhabitants of Beaune certain privileges and rights, and, following from a model set out by the neighbouring town of Dijon, in turn allowed Beaune to be an autonomous jurisdiction in 1203. Towards the end of the 100 Years' War, which had ravaged France, its kingdoms and its states since 1337, a prominent local figure, Nicolas Rolin, was awarded the role of Chancellor to Philip III, Duke of Burgundy, in 1422, and he quickly set about enforcing the Duke's many policies, helping the Burgundian state reach the apex of its prosperity and prestige, enabling it to become a leading centre of medieval arts. Though known as the Good, Philip III is perhaps best remembered for selling Joan of Arc to the English for 100 crowns, an act that encouraged the end of the war between the two nations. Rolin, on the other hand, was an oddity. Despite holding an official title, he was not born into nobility, but was instead gifted with riches and lands after having facilitated a friendship between the King of France and the Duke of Burgundy, and by brokering a peace treaty with the English. In recognition of his work, Rolin became one of the first members of the Order of the Golden Fleece, one of the most prestigious orders of chivalry in France. As the war was coming to an end, and after the signing of the Treaty of Arras in 1435, the expulsion of the English left the populace of Burgundy destitute. Plague had also recently affected the area, and armed bands of pillagers and murderers ravaged the local area, causing the peasantry to forego agriculture and flee to walled towns, thus worsening an ongoing famine, leaving 3/4 of the population indigent. Together with his wife, Guillaume de Salins, Rolin was devastated by the plague and famine that had swept over Burgundy as a direct result of the war, and felt that something had to be done to help the poor inhabitants of the city of Beaune. With the wealth he'd accumulated as Chancellor, Nicolas Rolin and Guillaume de Salins founded the Hôtel-Dieu in 1443 as a hospital for the poor. It is noted that his marriage was a happy one, and it is thought to be the influence of his wife that resulted in the building of the Hôtel-Dieu. Rolin declared his love for her by having the floor tiles inscribed with his motto, Seul, meaning only her. The institution was also blessed with the support of Pope Eugene IV, granted in 1441, and Philip the Good. The hospital charter is noteworthy. Rolla, in his wisdom, achieved tax relief and made the running of the hospital independent of the church and the state in a charter that still applies today, and ensured it would be funded by the numerous vineyards, farms and forests that surrounded Beaune in the 15th century. He also founded a sisterhood of nuns, Les Sœurs Hospitalières de Beaune, to care for the patients, the first of which was admitted in 1452. Having disapproved of the severity of the first sisters, Rolla subsequently changed the rules of the sisterhood, opening up the role to anyone of good reputation between the ages of 18 and 30, allowing them to leave to either marry or join a religious order at a later date. This allowed women to sign up for a limited time, yet be afforded the protection of the role of a nun without any stigma or pangs of conscience on leaving the sisterhood later. On Rolla's death, his wife strove hard to protect the charter and prevent the church from seizing the organization's wealth. Soon after, she joined the order to serve the sick until her death. There were some difficulties faced during the French Revolution, but the unusual charter allowed the hospital to regain its wealth and original purpose when Napoleon reinstated the nuns. The sisterhood was still caring for the sick up until the hospital treated its last patients in the early 1970s. All the while, the town too was enjoying fame as the centre for Burgundian wines and soon earned the moniker the capital of Burgundy wine. Today, Beaune is noted as being the centre of some of the most famous and prestigious vineyards in the world. The wealth accumulated by the winemakers can be seen in the architecture of the buildings throughout the town. Today, Beaune is a favourite amongst tourists seeking beautiful medieval monuments and wine lovers looking for that perfect bottle of Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. We'll start our tour here, in the city centre. Before we take a closer look at the Hôtel-Dieu, I'd like to take the opportunity to show you more of the town, and we'll start off with another religious building of interest, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame de Beaune. Built between the mid-12th and 15th centuries, during the transition from Romanesque to Gothic architecture, the cathedral features a mix of both styles. Its foundation is decidedly Romanesque, while much of the rest is Gothic. The porch you can see covering its original facade was added in the 16th century. Famed for its enormous early Gothic portal and exquisite 15th century tapestries of the Virgin and Child, it doesn't look like much from the outside. It's squat, wide, and unusually lacks any pictorial decorations of any kind. But inside, it's a different story entirely. Nicknamed the Daughter of Cluny, the cathedral was built on the Cluniac example of church architecture, and its interior is beautifully decorated with murals depicting the life of Lazarus and stained glass windows. At the far end of the nave stands a rare 12th century black Madonna, while the tapestries hanging behind the altar illustrate her life. Across from the cathedral is a rather unassuming and generic-looking building on the corner of Rue Vivant-Gardin and Rue Jean-François Moufou. But at the end of the 19th century, it was inhabited by the automotive pioneers, the Chevrolet family. After their parents had moved from Switzerland to Beaune, their three sons, Louis, Arthur and Gaston, developed their mechanical interests in the town when they entered a series of bicycle competitions. Louis went to Paris for a short time where he worked as a mechanic, and then the three brothers emigrated to Canada in 1900, before moving to New York City the following year to work at the Brooklyn operations of the French car manufacturer de Dion-Bouton. Then, in 1911, using what he had learned through experience working for other manufacturers, Louis established the Chevrolet Motor Car Company in Detroit, Michigan. And the rest, as they say, is history. Moving across the town, we can also see Beaune's impressive marketplace. There's been a market hall in Beaune for several centuries, and according to the French 19th century historian Charles Aubertin, there was a great hall here in 1203 when Beaune obtained its town charters, and that from the 14th century the market square was called the Forum Bladi, the marketplace for wheat. The foundation charter for the Hôtel-Dieu of 1443 mentioned a hall next to the square, and in 1515, King Francis I, considered to be France's first Renaissance monarch, gave the market hall to the town of Beaune in exchange for the town taking on responsibility for the maintenance and a fee of 50 livres. By then, the market hall was no longer just a place for selling and buying wheat. Butchers and fishmongers had moved in with coopers and drapers, and nearly 20 years later, Francis I granted the town the right to lease the market halls for a period that would last until 1829. Today's market hall is partly the result of the work by Ludovic Allier, an architect from the neighbouring town of Dijon, who, in 1901, was commissioned to design the building that would replace the old market hall. The town of Beaune had bought the old market hall and adjacent buildings in 1893 in order to be able to build a new and larger hall, and Allier's market hall was very much influenced by Les Halles in Paris, which itself was designed by Victor Baltard in the mid-19th century. In 1957, the mayor of Beaune, Roger Duchy, had the facade demolished in favour of a new, more Burgundian-looking style created by the architect Pierre Bec. A steep roof covered with flat tiles replaced the old one, and the cast iron columns were replaced with large limestone pillars. Saturday is market day in Beaune, and since the market hall itself was too small to accommodate all of the vendors, a large portion of the market stands is set up on the square outside and along nearby streets. Even so, inside you will encounter the hustle and bustle as Beaune's inhabitants peruse the stalls for local cheeses, fresh fruit and vegetables, meats and pastries, and the whole ambience is friendly as people meet friends and family and catch up on the week's occurrences. Next to the marketplace is the Hôtel-Dieu. Honour meant power, and this was all about showing off. Outside, its decoration is not so apparent so as not to attract looters and brigands, except perhaps for the beautiful canopy which overhangs the entrance, embellished with gold and marking the year of construction of the hospice, 1442. Let us enter and see what splendours the Hôtel-Dieu de Beaune has in store for us. Come on, follow me. Perhaps one of the most striking features of the dazzling inner courtyard is the colourful glazed roof, establishing a style recognised in France as typically Burgundian. The sturdy tiles, which last 300 years, are fired 3 times, once to harden the clay, again to burn in the colour, and finally for the glaze, and the last time they were replaced was in 1902. The elaborate decoration of the roof and the buildings on which they sit stems from the belief that beauty could heal the souls of the poor. The lacy, flamboyant Gothic design of the Hôtel-Dieu is attributed to Jacques Risquer, a Flemish architect, and the structure is formed by 4 two-storey buildings around a court of honour, and restoration work was carried out by Villette-le-Duc, the infamous French architect who also restored the Cité de Carcassonne in the mid-19th century. So, without further ado, let us go in and explore further. The focal point of the hospice is this, La Grande Chambre des Pauvres, or the Great Hall of the Poor, which could accommodate up to 60 patients. The vault, typical of halls of the period, was constructed like the hull of a ship, and a screen separates the hall from the chapel at the far end. Every 3 hours, the door was opened, and the invalid patients could experience Mass from their beds. In the ceiling, crossbeams are held by the mouths of creatively carved monsters. Each mouth is stretched realistically, and each face has individual characteristics. Between the crossbars are the busts of real 15th century townsfolk, leading citizens with animals humorously indicating their foibles. A carved wooden statue over the main entrance to this incredible room shows a bound Christ, demonstrating to patients that their Saviour suffered and was able to emphasise with them with their ordeal. Its realism shows that Gothic art had moved away from the stiff formality of Romanesque carvings. The room was, and still is, lined by 4 poster curtained beds, which, at the time, could have been shared by 2 patients. The sick were given help and support by Hospitalier nuns, who later had to follow the new order's rule that Nicolas Rollin had drawn up for them, which consisted basically in poverty, chastity, and obedience.
In an advanced view of the importance of cleanliness, Rollin banned the use of wooden bowls for patients, and instead each patient was assigned his or her own napkin, plus a tin bowl and mug. You may be able to see a small candlestick next to each bed as well. If a patient died in the night, the candle was extinguished. Unfortunately, the Great Hall has lost some of its authenticity and its present state as a result of the neo-Gothic restoration undertaken between 1872 and 78 by Viollet-le-Duc. The hospice was not a place of hope. People came here to die, and care was more for the soul than it was for the body.
The stained glass window here in the chapel at the far end of the Great Hall shows Nicolas Rollin on the lower left and his wife, Guidonne, opposite him, dressed as a nun to show her devotion. Rollin's feudal superior, the Duke of Burgundy, is seen above him. St. Nicholas is shown in green and St. Anthony in yellow. Notice too what is happening on Golgotha. As Jesus is crucified, the souls of the two criminals with him are being snatched up, one by an angel and the other by a red devil. At the bottom, Mary cradles the dead body of Christ.
Just behind the Hall of the Poor, we can see the Salle Saint-Hugues, which was created in 1645. This room was financed by Hugues Berthaud, a councillor to the King of France, and later became an important benefactor for the Hôtel-Dieu, thus saving it from ruin. The room contains 12 beds destined to the sick presenting the least severe symptoms, and is known for a series of paintings by the French Baroque artist Isaac Moyon, which represent miracles of the saint hanging on the walls. Hugues' brother, Louis Berthaud, another benefactor to the hospital, funded a room which completed the central court named for Saint Louis in 1661. Louis XIV visited the Hôtel-Dieu in 1658 and criticised the practice of having mixed-sex wards, and subsequently donated funds to make suitable arrangements to separate them. In the 17th century, one of the first pharmacies established within a hospital's walls was established here, and hundreds of phials of medicine were lined up on its shelves, as you can still see behind me. The vases are made of glass and have different dimensions and forms, used to contain the various substances which mainly derive from local ingredients. The original pharmacy, where the sisters made all necessary medications, at times with help from apothecaries, still retains a very impressive collection of equipment and a baffling array of ingredients, including powdered woodlice and crayfish eyes. A medicinal garden within the complex provided many of the necessary ingredients. In the charitable vein of which the hospital was founded, the bread ovens were also used to bake bread for the poor, and the hospital charter protected the use of the well for patients only. Right next to the pharmacy is the old laboratory. It became a pharmacy in 1788 when, for economic reasons, it was decided to replace the apothecary services with the employment of 2 nun pharmacists who started selling medicines. The room is adorned with an 18th century painting by Charles Souville, representing the apothecary and featuring the chemist Claude Morlot preparing remedies with some of his assistants in the dispensary in Beaune. Perhaps one of the Hospice de Beaune's most treasured pieces is the altarpiece that once adorned the apse of a chapel behind the Great Hall. Painted by the early Netherlandish painter Roger van der Weyden between 1445 and 1450, the Last Judgment consists of 15 paintings on 9 panels, of which 6 are painted on both sides. Unusually for the period, it retains some of its original frames. 6 of the outer panels have hinges for folding. When closed, the exterior view of saints and donors is visible. So that the 2 halves can be seen at once, the altarpiece has been split, the open portion on my right with the closed portion on my left. Let us take a closer look.
When the shutters are opened, the viewer is exposed to the expansive Last Judgment interior panels. Just as with the iconography visible in the timpani of cathedrals and churches, the scene documents the possible spiritual fates of the viewers, that they might reach heaven or hell, salvation or damnation, stark alternatives appropriate for a hospice. As with other altarpieces by van der Weyden, the background landscape and arrangements of figures extend across individual panels of the lower register to the extent that the separations between panels are ignored. There are instances of figures painted across two adjoining panels, whereas Christ and St. Michael are enclosed within a single central panel, giving emphasis to the iconography. The celestial sphere towards which the saved move is dramatically presented with a radiant gold background spanning almost the entire width of the altarpiece. The large central panel spans both registers and shows Christ seated on a rainbow in judgment, while below him the Archangel Michael holds scales to weigh souls. The lower register forms a continuous landscape representing Earth, with the panel on the far left showing the gates of heaven, while the entrance to hell is on the far right. The imposing figure of Christ indicates the reign of heaven is about to begin, and distinction between the earthly and heavenly realms creates a sense of order, and Christ exudes calm and control, and a sense of balance and movement throughout the panels. In the upper panel, Christ sits in judgment. He holds a lily in his right hand and a sword in his left, and sits on a rainbow extending across two panels, his feet resting on a sphere. His right hand is raised in the act of benediction, and his left hand is lowered. These positions indicate the act of judgment. He is deciding if souls are to be sent to heaven or hell, his gestures echoing the direction and positioning of the scales held by the Archangel Michael beneath him. His palms are open, revealing the wounds sustained when they were nailed to the cross, while, in places, his tunic gapes, making visible the injury caused by the lance from which pours deep red blood. Christ's face is identical to the representation in the Brack triptych, completed only a few years later in 1452. Christ, placed so high in a pictorial space and spanning both registers, orchestrates the entirety of the inner panels. Whereas earlier Last Judgments might have seemed chaotic, here he brings a sense of order. The Archangel Michael, as the embodiment and conduit of divine justice, is positioned directly below Christ, the only figure to reach both heaven and earth. He wears a dispassionate expression as he holds a set of scales to weigh the souls. Unusually for Christian art, the damned outweigh the blessed. Michael's scales have only one soul in each pan, yet the pan tips below the right. Michael is given unusual prominence in the Last Judgment for the period, and his powerful presence emphasizes the work's function in a hospice and its preoccupation with the liturgy of death. His feet are positioned as if he were stepping forward, about to move out of the canvas, and he looks directly at the observer, giving the illusion of judging not only the souls in the painting, but also us, the viewer. Michael, like Sebastian and Anthony, was a plague saint, and his image would have been visible to the patients through the openings of a pierced screen as they lay in their beds. He is portrayed with iconographic elements associated with the Last Judgment, and, dressed in a red cloak with woven golden fabrics over a shining white alb, is, by far, the most colourful figure in the lower panels, and hypnotically attracts the viewer's gaze. He is surrounded by 4 cherubs playing trumpets to call the dead to their final destination. Michael's role in the Last Judgment is emphasized through van der Weyden's use of colour. Michael's gleaming white alb contrasts with the cherub's red vestments set against the blue sky directly below heaven's golden clouds. Both of the upper register wings contain a pair of angels holding instruments of the Passion, including a lance, a crown of thorns, and a stick with a sponge soaked in vinegar. The angels are dressed in white liturgical vestments, including an alb and an amice. Beneath Michael, souls scurry left and right. The saved walk towards the gates of heaven, where they are greeted by a saint. The damned arrive at the mouth of hell and fall en masse into damnation. The blessed look towards Christ. The banished look down. Both groups are tilted in the direction of Christ's hands. Reinforcing this, inscriptions in Latin around the groupings read virtutes, or virtues, and peccata, sins. The souls undergo a gradual transformation as they move from panel to panel. Those rising from their graves at Michael's feet show little expression, but become more animated as they move to either side. Horror and desperation become especially visible on the faces of the damned as they move towards hell. The Virgin Mary, John the Baptist, the 12 apostles, and an assortment of dignitaries are positioned in a daisis at either side of Michael. The apostles are seated in a semicircle. St. Peter is dressed in red on the far left, and St. Paul, dressed in green, is on the far right. The 7 halo dignitaries dressed in contemporary clothing are unidentified but include a king, a pope, a bishop, a monk, and 3 women. Rather than the general representative types, they are portraits of specific unidentified individuals. Heaven is represented by an entrance to the heavenly city, which is in a contemporary Gothic style illuminated by long, thin rays of light. The saved approached clasping their hands in prayer and are greeted at the entrance by an angel. Only a few souls pass through the heavenly gates at a time, which are painted to resemble the entrance of the Hospice de Beaune. The way to heaven is shown clearly as a gilded church. The saved ascend a set of steps, turn right, and then disappear from sight. It is fully enclosed in a single panel, whereas hell extends onto the adjoining panel, perhaps hinting that sin contaminates all around it. When the shutters are closed, the polyptych resembles the upper portion of a cross. The elevated central panel allowed additional space for a narrative scene depicting a heavenly vista, a single large figure, or a crucifixion with space for the cross to extend above the other panels. Roger van der Weyden conveys the heavenly sphere in the tall vertical panel, whereas that of the earth is relegated to the lower register panels on the exterior view. Moreover, the T-shape echoes the typical configuration of Gothic churches, where the nave often extends past the transept into the apse or choir. The imagery of the outer panels is set in the earthly realm, with the characters painted in grisaille to imitate sculpture, so that the work clearly distinguishes between figures of the divine, earthly, and hellish realms. The 6 exterior panels consist of 2 donor wings, 2 containing saints, and 2 panels to Gabriel presenting himself to Mary. The donors, Nicolas Rollin and his wife Guyone de Saint-Lin, are on the outer wings, kneeling in front of their prayer books. 4 imitation statues make up the inner panels. The lower 2 depict Saint Sebastian and Saint Anthony. Sebastian was the patron saint of plagues and an intercessory against epidemics. Anthony, the patron saint of skin diseases and egotism. The 2 saints had close associations with the Burgundian court. Philip the Good was born on Saint Anthony's Day. He had an illegitimate son named Anthony, and 2 of Rollin's sons were named Anthony as well, whereas Saint Sebastian was the patron saint of Philip the Good's chivalric order of the Golden Fleece, of which Rollin was a member. The 2 small upper register panels show a conventional Annunciation scene, with the usual dove representing the Holy Spirit. The 2 sets of panels, unlike those of the interior, are compositionally very different. The figures occupy distinctly separate niches, and the colour schemes of the grisaille saints and the donors contrast sharply.
It is perhaps no surprise, given the Burgundian saying that no asset is more precious than vines, that gifts of vineyards were richly bestowed upon the Hospice. Since 1457, when the first vineyard was gifted to the Hospice, vineyards have been donated by many to support the work of the Hôtel-Dieu. Today, the Hospice owns approximately 60 hectares or 150 acres of mostly Côte de Beaune and Côte de Nuit, and a little bit of Puy-Fussé. These gifts were doubtly generous in that the wine was considered to have both health-giving properties and be rich in nutrients. The sisters of the hospital used wine into fairly ubiquitous treatment, preferably hot and with relevant plant additions. Today, the Hospice de Beaune is equally famed for its wine auctions, which have been held annually since 1859. Traditionally sold by candlelight on the 3rd Sunday of November, the auctions the highlight of a 3-day wine and food festival called Les Trois Glorieuses, and which attracted famous fans such as Thomas Jefferson when he was the French ambassador for America. However, we cannot simply skim over the wine of southern Burgundy without visiting a winery. So join me in part 2 to better understand the Côte de Beaune and discover the unique cellars and fascinating history of the Château de Meursault. I'll see you in a minute.